For 15 years, I, Mildred Carter, 38 years old, sent my parents $3,000 a month to save my brother's life. They claimed he was dying a severe heart condition, critical, no hope, without my help. My husband and I scraped by, skipping vacations, eating cheap meals, pouring every spare dollar into their hands. I believed them, trusted them, until that family dinner. They raised their glasses, toasting my parents' selfless sacrifice for my brother's care. I smiled, but my stomach twisted. I'd seen it, the sprawling Harrisburg mansion, the gleaming new cars, my brother laughing healthy, not a trace of illness. They thought I was clueless, the fool who'd keep paying forever. Their smug voices dripped with pride as they mocked my faith in them. I didn't shout or cry. I lifted my glass, looked my mother in the eye, and said, "Lies expire, and yours just did." Silence. Her face froze. They had no idea I'd already uncovered their deception. I didn't argue. I just smiled and pressed one button. One tap on my phone sent an email that would unravel everything. What happened next? Let's just say their world crumbled and I never looked back. Have you ever been betrayed by the ones you trusted most? Drop a comment below with your story. Where did it happen, and how did you find out? Hit that like button if family secrets make your blood boil, and share this video to see how far this lie went. Stick around, you won't believe what they hid. In a modest Harrisburg neighborhood, 10-year-old Stanley Carter stood quietly by the window watching his father dote on his younger brother. Raymond Walsh, 50. A stern bank manager with prematurely graying hair and sharp eyes, showered Logan Walsh, his 8-year-old son, from his second marriage, with praise, brand-new bicycles, and expensive baseball gear. Meanwhile, Stanley, the child from Raymond's failed first marriage, received only hand-me-down clothes and cold stares. He learned early that he was the mistake his father wished to forget. Frances Walsh, 48. Stanley's stepmother was an elegant woman with a gentle yet distant smile. She tried to seem kind, a pat on the shoulder, a polite, "Have you eaten yet?" But her real affection was reserved for Logan, the son she had carried and raised since birth. Stanley could feel it clearly, a quiet ache, as if he were merely a guest in his own home. Raymond's favoritism was anything but subtle. When Logan scribbled a crude drawing, Raymond pinned it on the refrigerator, boasting to neighbors, "My boy's a genius." Yet when Stanley brought home a report card full of A's, the only response was a muttered, "Keep it up." At 12, Stanley built a rocket model for the science fair, spending weeks on it. Raymond didn't show up. He was busy coaching Logan's little league team. Frances nodded at the trophy, saying, "That's nice," but her eyes followed the muddy shoes of her son. Stanley swallowed his hurt and swore he would prove his worth someday. By 16, Stanley buried himself in his studies, earning top grades and joining the debate club, doing everything he could to stand out. But one evening, he overheard Raymond telling a neighbor Logan is the real star. Stanley's chest tightened, yet he kept pushing forward. At 18, he earned a full scholarship to the University of Pittsburgh. Raymond didn't congratulate him, he merely asked when Stanley would help Logan with his college applications. Frances packed a lunch for the trip, her only gesture of care, though it felt hollow. In Pittsburgh, Stanley met Mildred Carter, a 20-year-old computer science student with short hair, sharp eyes, and a gift for seeing through people. They bonded over late-night study sessions in the library, sharing stories of their lives. Stanley told her about Harrisburg, about Logan's shadow that loomed over everything. Mildred listened, her jaw tightening as he described Raymond's favoritism. "Your father isn't fair," she said firmly. "You're more than what he sees." Her words sparked a quiet rebellion in Stanley. He was no longer the forgotten son. Mildred understood the burden Stanley carried, the constant need to prove himself. She encouraged him to focus on his own path instead of chasing his father's approval. They fell in love, building a life fueled by shared ambition, though Stanley never fully escaped his past. When 15-year-old Logan started high school, Raymond called for advice about his rising star. Stanley clenched his teeth, but still offered guidance, hoping for a shred of respect. Frances sent a thank you letter signing it "Love Mom," though it felt like mere politeness. Years later, as Stanley and Mildred prepared to marry, Raymond appeared unexpectedly. He patted his son's shoulder, saying, "You've done well," but spent the entire visit talking about Logan's baseball scholarship. Mildred watched closely, eyes narrowing. Pulling Stanley aside, she whispered, "Your brother isn't better than you. Don't let them define who you are." Stanley nodded, but the wound lingered. He wanted to believe he could break free from his father's favoritism. Back in Harrisburg, Stanley's visits grew rare. Raymond's calls were always about Logan, the games, the grades, the victories. Still, Stanley sent money whenever the family faced trouble, believing it was his duty as the older brother. But deep inside, a quiet question kept growing. Would I ever be enough for my father? In a small Pittsburgh apartment, Mildred reviewed their dwindling bank account. She and her husband Stanley lived from one paycheck to the next, their modest life shaped by a single decision: sending $3,000 every month to his family in Harrisburg. They believed Logan, Stanley's younger brother, was battling a heart condition and surviving only through costly treatments. Mildred, a software engineer working long hours, and Stanley, a high school teacher grading papers late into the night, scraped together what they could to keep those payments going. They never questioned it. Family was family, and Stanley felt it was his duty. Their home was sparse, furnished with second-hand tables and a creaky couch. Date nights meant takeout pizza instead of restaurants. Vacations were out of reach, replaced by extra shifts and side jobs. Once Mildred found a cozy house for sale in a quiet Pittsburgh suburb, perfect for starting a family. She showed Stanley the listing, her eyes full of hope. He hesitated, then shook his head. "Logan needs us," he said heavily. The house remained just a picture on her phone, a dream they shelved to keep his brother alive. Stanley's father called often, his tone urgent, updating them on Logan's supposed hospital stays. Frances, Stanley's stepmother, sent handwritten thank you notes praising their generosity. Mildred read each one, tracing the neat script, but something unsettled her. The letters felt rehearsed, too polished. Then one evening, while sorting through emails, she found a message from Logan. It was brief, requesting another payment for emergency meds. The sender's address looked off, slightly different from the usual hospital domain. Mildred frowned, her gut twisting. She didn't tell Stanley yet, not wanting to challenge his loyalty, but doubt began to take root. She started paying closer attention. Stanley handled most of the family calls, nodding as his father described Logan's latest crisis. Mildred overheard one, catching Raymond's voice shift when she entered the room. "Everything okay?" she asked later, keeping her tone light. He shrugged. "They're just worried about my brother," he said, but his voice lacked conviction. Mildred began saving copies of the emails, noting small inconsistencies, dates that didn't match, vague medical terms. She didn't push Stanley, knowing how deeply he wanted to believe his family's story. Their sacrifices kept mounting. Mildred skipped a work conference to cut costs. Stanley declined a teaching award dinner, citing finances. They stopped talking about the house, though Mildred sometimes caught Stanley staring at real estate ads, his face drawn with longing. "We're doing the right thing," he'd murmur, almost to himself. Mildred nodded, but her unease grew. She dug deeper, cross-referencing bank transfers with emails. The totals were staggering, over $500,000 sent in 15 years. Their life savings gone to Harrisburg. One night, Mildred sat Stanley down. "Your father sent another request," she said, holding up her phone. "This one's from a new account." Stanley frowned, his brow furrowed. "It's probably just a mix-up," he replied, though his tone was uncertain. Mildred didn't argue, but began keeping a private log of every transfer and email. She wasn't ready to accuse anyone, not yet. Stanley's devotion to his family ran deep, forged by years of trying to prove himself. She loved him for it, but she couldn't ignore the cracks appearing in their story. The breaking point came during a call from Frances. Her voice was warm, thanking them for saving her son, But Mildred caught a mention of Logan's new car before Frances quickly corrected herself. Mildred's pulse spiked. She didn't confront her, but filed the detail away. Stanley noticed her quiet that night. "You okay?" he asked gently. "Just tired," she lied, not ready to shatter his trust. But her doubts had become a storm. Their routine continued: work bills and the endless transfers to Harrisburg. Mildred kept her suspicions to herself, waiting for the right moment. But the weight of those choices pressed harder each day, and she knew the truth was closing in. The Harrisburg sun was setting as Stanley and Mildred arrived for the family dinner. Stanley's grip tightened on the steering wheel after their 3-hour drive from Pittsburgh. Mildred adjusted her scarf, her mind replaying the strange emails from her brother-in-law. They stepped out, greeted by a sprawling house with tall columns and manicured shrubs, a stark contrast to their cramped apartment. 2 gleaming SUVs sat in the driveway, their chrome catching the last light. Mildred's pulse quickened, but she kept her face composed, glancing at her husband. Inside, Raymond welcomed them, his voice booming with practiced warmth. Frances set the table, her smile strained, while Logan, broad-shouldered and tanned, strode in, tossing a football. Stanley froze, his eyes fixed on his younger brother, who looked anything but ill. "You're doing well?" Stanley managed, his voice faltering. Logan grinned and clapped his shoulder. "Never better, man." Mildred's jaw tightened, her suspicions from those emails now blazing into certainty. Dinner began, plates stacked with steak and wine flowing freely. Raymond raised a glass, toasting family unity and his own tireless support for Logan's recovery. Frances nodded, echoing his words. Mildred watched in silence as Logan laughed about his recent vacation. "Must be nice," she murmured, her tone sharp, yet unnoticed. Stanley tried to join the chatter, mentioning his students, but his father cut him off, boasting about Logan's new promotion. The room felt smaller, the air thick with pretense. Then it happened. Logan leaned back, smirking. "You're still sending those checks, right, Stan? Like a good old fool?" Raymond chuckled, and Frances looked away, her hands trembling. Stanley's face flushed, his fork clattering onto the plate. Mildred's heart pounded. She saw everything clearly now: the deceit, the ridicule, the betrayal. They had counted on Stanley's loyalty, on him being too devoted to question them. Her fingers brushed her phone in her pocket, where she'd drafted an email to the state's Financial Oversight Board detailing Raymond's suspicious accounts. She didn't waver. As dessert was served, Raymond bragged about their hard-earned home, gesturing toward the chandelier above. Frances mentioned a new boat they'd bought, then faltered under Mildred's steady stare. Stanley's voice came low and strained. "You said Logan was dying." Raymond waved a hand dismissively. "He's fine now, thanks to us." Logan snorted, adding, "You actually believed that, didn't you?" The words hit Stanley like a blow, his hands shaking. Mildred rose, her chair scraping against the floor. "Your father's been clear?" she said to Stanley, her tone calm but firm. "They've been using us." She turned to Raymond, her eyes cold. "You think we wouldn't see through it?" Raymond Frances gasped, but Logan just laughed, tossing his napkin aside. "Relax, it's just family, helping family." Stanley's breath caught his face pale. He had given everything, years of sacrifice and dreams, for this. Mildred didn't argue. She pulled out her phone, thumb hovering over the screen. Raymond's confident smile flickered, sensing her resolve. Frances reached out, stammering, "Mildred, please, let's talk." But it was too late. Mildred pressed send. The email to the Oversight Board, packed with evidence of Raymond's schemes, was gone. The room fell silent, their faces frozen. "Lies expire," she said evenly, "and yours just did." Stanley looked at her, shock giving way to understanding. He stood beside her, his voice quiet but steady. "You used me," he said to his father. Raymond scoffed, but unease flashed in his eyes. Logan leaned forward, sneering. "What are you gonna do? Stan, cry about it?" Mildred slipped her phone back into her pocket, her expression unreadable. She had set something irreversible in motion, and they didn't know it yet. The dinner ended abruptly. Excuses mumbled as Raymond and Frances cleared the plates. Logan shot Stanley a mocking grin before heading upstairs. Mildred took her husband's hand, leading him to the car. Neither spoke during the drive back, the mansion shrinking in the rearview mirror. The truth was out, and with one tap, Mildred had changed everything. Back in Pittsburgh, Mildred opened her laptop at dawn, her fingers flying across the keys. The sting from the Harrisburg dinner still burned, sharpening her focus. She wasn't just angry, she was determined. Her husband sat quietly, still reeling from his family's betrayal, but Mildred was already several steps ahead, intent on exposing the lies. She had sent the email to the oversight board, but that was only the beginning. She needed proof, airtight, undeniable evidence to bring Raymond down. Mildred called Gregory Reed, a trusted colleague and data analyst with a knack for uncovering patterns. "I need your help," she said, her voice steady. Gregory, sharp and loyal, didn't hesitate. They met at a coffee shop, laptops open, digging into Raymond's financial trail. Mildred shared the suspicious emails she'd saved, each one a breadcrumb leading closer to the truth. Gregory cross-referenced bank records, his brow furrowing. "These transfers don't add up," he said, pointing to accounts tied to a company called Walsh Investments. Mildred's pulse quickened. Her father-in-law's name was no coincidence. She brought in Joyce Foster, a private investigator renowned for cracking fraud cases. Joyce, a no-nonsense woman with a sharp eye, got straight to work. "Give me a week," she told Mildred, already pulling records from Harrisburg's public databases. Joyce traced Walsh Investments to a shell company, its filings vague but linked to Raymond's old banking associates. She found deposits matching the exact amount Stanley had sent, $3,000 a month, funneled into accounts that purchased properties across Pennsylvania. Mildred's stomach churned. "Your father used our money to play real estate tycoon," she told Stanley, her voice tight. He clenched his fists, saying nothing. Gregory uncovered more tax filings showing that Raymond's company owned a Harrisburg mansion and a beachfront condo. Joyce confirmed that the SUVs in the driveway were leased under the same company, not a dime from Raymond's own pocket. "He's been living large on your dime," Joyce said, handing Mildred a stack of documents. The numbers were staggering. Over $500,000 of Stanley's sacrifices poured into Raymond's empire. Mildred's resolve hardened. This wasn't just betrayal, it was theft. Stanley struggled to process it. "My brother knew," he said quietly. Mildred nodded, her eyes fierce. "Your mother too. They all played us." She didn't soften the truth. Stanley needed to face it. She contacted Martin Hayes, a skilled lawyer specializing in financial fraud. Martin, meticulous and driven, reviewed the evidence. "This is solid," he said, flipping through Joyce's findings. "We can file a civil suit for fraud and unjust enrichment. Raymond won't slip away from this." Mildred and Martin mapped out a strategy. The lawsuit would target Raymond's assets, every property, every car bought with Stanley's money. Joyce dug deeper, uncovering emails between Raymond and a shady broker discussing offshore accounts to hide profits. Gregory flagged transactions that bypassed tax reporting, adding weight to their case. Using her tech skills, Mildred traced the email domain Logan had used, confirming it was a fake hospital address created to deceive them. Each new discovery fit perfectly into the puzzle of greed. Stanley hesitated, torn by loyalty. "They're still family," he said one night, his voice breaking. Mildred took his hand. "They chose money over you, Stanley. We're fighting for what's right." Her words steadied him. He nodded and signed the legal papers Martin had prepared. The lawsuit named Raymond, Frances, and Logan as co-conspirators, accusing them of orchestrating a decade-long scheme. Mildred felt a surge of purpose. She wasn't just avenging their loss. She was dismantling their lies. Martin warned them it wouldn't be quick. "The courts move slowly, but we've got them cornered," he said. Joyce kept tabs on Raymond's movements, reporting that he had started liquidating assets, clearly sensing danger. Mildred wasn't surprised. Her father-in-law was cunning, but she was smarter. She and Gregory built a detailed timeline of every payment linking it to property deeds. Joyce interviewed a former colleague of Raymond's who admitted knowing about the fake company but staying silent for a cut. The evidence was airtight. As the lawsuit took shape, Mildred felt a shift. She was no longer just Stanley's wife, she was his shield, turning their pain into power. Stanley began to see it too, his quiet anger fueling their fight. Together they were ready to face his family in court and tear down the facade Raymond had built. The truth was no longer hidden, it had become their weapon. On a quiet Tuesday, Mildred sent the email that changed everything. Her report to the state's Financial Oversight Board triggered a full-scale investigation into Raymond Walsh's accounts. Within months, authorities moved swiftly, freezing his funds and seizing assets tied to Walsh investments. The Harrisburg mansion with its tall white columns was boarded up. The gleaming SUVs disappeared from the driveway, repossessed by the state. A beachfront condo in Raymond's portfolio was auctioned off to pay penalties. The empire built on Stanley's money collapsed overnight. Mildred and Stanley watched the news unfold from Pittsburgh, their modest apartment now a place of quiet resolve. Martin Hayes, their attorney, called them into his office. "The state's got enough to bury them," he said evenly. "They want to meet." Stanley's jaw tightened, but Mildred nodded. "Let them come," she replied, her tone firm. She'd sacrificed years for a lie, and now the truth was dismantling Raymond's world. The meeting took place in Martin's Pittsburgh office, a sleek room with glass walls. Raymond, Francis, and Logan arrived looking drained. Raymond's swagger was gone, replaced by a hunched, defeated posture. Francis clutched a handkerchief, eyes red. Logan, once the cocky athlete, slouched in his chair, avoiding eye contact. Mildred sat beside her husband, gaze steady, while Martin leafed through the documents. The air was heavy, the silence broken only by the rustle of papers. Raymond spoke first, his voice trembling. "We never meant for it to go this far," he said, glancing at Stanley. "You're my son. We needed help." Stanley's eyes narrowed, fingers gripping the chair. "You needed my money," he replied, low and sharp. Francis sobbed, reaching toward him. "We thought we were protecting Logan," she stammered. Mildred leaned forward, her voice cold. "Protecting him from what? A fake illness you stole from us, Francis." Logan shifted uneasily. "It wasn't all lies," he muttered. Mildred turned to him, eyes blazing. "Your brother gave up everything for you," she said, her words cutting deep. "You laughed in his face." Logan flinched, his bravado gone. Raymond tried again, desperation creeping in. "We can fix this, Stanley. Drop the suit. We're family." Stanley's expression hardened. "You stopped being family when you called me a fool," he said, steady and calm. Martin slid a document across the table, evidence of fraudulent accounts, forged medical bills, and properties purchased with Stanley's payments. "You're facing both civil and criminal charges," he stated, professional and firm. Francis gasped, the handkerchief slipping from her fingers. "We'll lose everything," she whispered. Mildred didn't blink. "You already did," she said, her voice like steel. Raymond's face twisted, anger and fear mingling. "Mildred, you're tearing us apart," he said, pointing at her. She didn't flinch. "You tore us apart when you lied for 15 years, she shot back. "Your father built a castle on our sacrifices, Stanley. He doesn't get to beg now." Stanley nodded, his resolve unwavering. He looked at his father, his stepmother, his brother. "You chose this," he said, final and firm. Logan's last plea broke the silence. "Stan, I didn't know it'd hurt you this bad," he said, voice cracking. Stanley met his eyes, the weight of years behind his words. "You knew enough," he said quietly. "You took my money and mocked me for it." Mildred squeezed his hand, her silence stronger than anger. She had fought for this, not just justice, but for Stanley to reclaim his worth. Martin closed his folder. "The civil suit moves forward," he said. "The state's investigation is separate. You'll hear from them soon." Raymond's shoulders slumped, face pale. Frances wept openly, but no one comforted her. Logan stared at the floor, hands trembling. The meeting ended without another word. Mildred and Stanley stayed seated, their hands still clasped. As they drove home, Pittsburgh's skyline rose ahead. Stanley broke the silence. "I thought I'd feel guilty," he murmured. Mildred glanced over, her eyes softening for the first time that day. "You don't owe them anything," she said. The weight of victory was heavy, but it was theirs. Raymond's empire was gone, and the truth had finally set them free. 3 years later, Stanley received a call about his father that reignited his resolve. Floyd Parker, a former colleague of Raymond's from his banking days, reached out with a warning. "He's at it again," Floyd murmured, his tone grave. Stanley, now 43, felt a familiar knot tighten in his stomach. His father's schemes had already cost him years of savings, but this time it wasn't about revenge, it was about protecting someone else. Stanley met Floyd at a diner in Pittsburgh, the air thick with the scent of coffee and frying bacon. Floyd, weathered but sharp-eyed, slid a folder across the table. Inside were emails showing Raymond pitching a dubious real estate deal to a small business owner in Harrisburg. "He's promising massive returns using fake contracts," Floyd explained. "The guy's about to lose everything." Stanley's jaw clenched. His father hadn't learned. Stripped of his fortune, he was still exploiting trust. Stanley called his wife to share the news. "Your father's found a new target," he told Mildred, his voice steady, but heavy. She didn't hesitate. "Then we stop him," she replied firmly. They contacted Joyce Foster, the investigator who'd helped them before. Precise as ever, Joyce agreed to dig into Raymond's latest operation. "He's slippery, but not invisible," she said, already pulling up public records on her laptop. Joyce soon uncovered a trail of forged documents. Raymond had formed a new company, Parker Holdings, using Floyd's name without permission to appear legitimate. The contracts promised the business owner, a man named Carl, a stake in a non-existent development project. Stanley felt a surge of anger but also purpose. "He's not destroying another life," he told Mildred, eyes fierce. She nodded, her hand finding his. "We'll end this." They moved quickly. Joyce traced Raymond's emails to an address in Harrisburg, confirming he was operating from a rented office. Floyd provided inside details, recalling how Raymond used charm to mask deceit. "He tried to rope me in," Floyd admitted. "I walked away, but Carl's too trusting." Together, Stanley and Joyce compiled evidence: fake contracts, forged signatures, and bank transfers to an offshore account. The scheme was smaller than before, but just as cruel. Stanley took the lead, contacting the state's Financial Oversight Board. He filed a detailed report attaching Joyce's findings and Floyd's testimony. "My father's defrauding again," he wrote, choosing each word carefully. Joyce followed up with a call to Carl, warning him about the scam. "Don't sign anything," she urged. Carl, shaken but grateful, backed out of the deal. Stanley felt a weight lift, not only for Carl but for himself. Authorities acted swiftly. Raymond's new company was shut down, its accounts frozen. His access to financial systems was revoked, cutting off his ability to manipulate funds. Joyce confirmed the news, her tone calm but satisfied. "He's got no leverage now," she said. Stanley exhaled, his resolve unbroken. This wasn't vengeance, it was justice for someone who couldn't fight alone. Mildred stood beside him, pride shining in her eyes. "You did the right thing," she said softly but with strength. Stanley nodded, feeling a power he hadn't known before. His father's shadow no longer defined him. He had protected a stranger and, in doing so, reclaimed his own peace. 10 years after the dinner, Stanley stood in his Pittsburgh backyard watching his children play. Emma, their 10-year-old daughter, chased her 7-year-old brother Liam through the grass, laughter echoing across the yard. The modest house behind them, bought with years of hard work, felt like a refuge. Stanley, now 50, smiled as his wife joined him, her hand slipping into his. Mildred, 48, radiated quiet strength, her eyes reflecting a decade of peace, hard-earned. Their lives had changed. The wounds of betrayal had faded, replaced by a family grounded in trust. Stanley taught history at a local high school while Mildred led a tech startup, her success shaped by perseverance. They raised Emma and Liam to value integrity and accountability. Own your mistakes. Stanley told them often, his voice calm but firm. No one else carries them for you. Mildred would add, and never let anyone decide your worth. One evening, a letter arrived from Harrisburg. It was from a nurse explaining that Raymond, now 75, was gravely ill and asking to see his son. Stanley read it quietly, his face unreadable. Mildred watched, resting a hand on his shoulder. "Your father's reaching out," she said softly. Stanley folded the letter and shook his head. "He doesn't get to come back now," he replied, steady and certain. The man who had deceived him for years no longer had a place in their lives. Stanley's decision wasn't driven by anger but by clarity. He had spent years sacrificing for a lie, mistaking pain for duty. Now he understood that real duty meant protecting his family, Emma, Liam, and Mildred, not a father who had used him. He mailed a short reply to the nurse declining the visit. "I wish him peace," he wrote, "but I'm done." Mildred supported him, her silence steady and sure. They had fought too hard to reopen old wounds. Emma overheard them one night and asked, "Why don't you see Grandpa?" Stanley knelt, meeting her eyes. "Sometimes people make choices that break trust," he said gently. "We choose who we let close." Liam, listening nearby, nodded. Mildred added, "You two will always know who you are. That's what matters most." Their children absorbed the lesson early: family isn't owed, it's earned. Together, Stanley and Mildred built a life around purpose. They volunteered at a community center, teaching kids financial literacy to guard against scams like Raymond's. Stanley shared his past not to dwell on pain, but to show how choices shape lives. "Every decision counts," he told his students, his words carrying the weight of experience. Mildred mentored young women in tech, encouraging them to stand firm against manipulation. Their lives became a quiet proof of healing through action, not resentment. The letter from Harrisburg crossed Stanley's mind now and then, but never long enough to unsettle him. He no longer bore guilt for his father's ruin. Raymond's illness was the outcome of his own path, not Stanley's burden. Watching her husband embrace that truth, Mildred felt deep pride. Their family was whole not because of wealth or forgiveness, but because they had chosen honesty and peace. One night after the children had fallen asleep, Mildred sat beside Stanley on the porch. "We've come far," she said softly. "We taught Emma and Liam what your father never learned, that responsibility isn't about what you owe others. It's about owning your life." Stanley nodded, his hand closing around hers. "And freedom comes from letting go," he said. Mildred looked toward the stars, her voice steady. "This story isn't just ours. It's for anyone who's been used and thinks they have to carry someone else's lies. You don't. You choose your path, and that's power."